Hey there everybody, it's markcrilley. I'm back with another video. This is number 29 in my ongoing series of videos about creating comics. I will put a link to the playlist where you can see all of those videos, really trying to get everything that I know about writing and illustrating comic books into this series of videos. Today we're going to be talking about backgrounds, environments, locations, and as always I'll be using my own books as an example. So let's not waste any more time, let's go ahead and get into it. If you want readers to have a strong sense of location, use at least one large panel wide shot early in the scene. Now this is a topic that I've covered before in other videos, but it really is the most important lesson to learn when it comes to establishing location. I thought I would begin with a kind of a negative example. I'll show you what happens when you don't firmly establish location. This first story that I did years ago, I really did not do much in terms of backgrounds. This first panel here really just gives you a sketchy little view of the mountainside village. Suddenly we're inside a room. There are no backgrounds. We don't know what his room looks like. Now it's sort of a cute cartoony style, so I don't know if it's necessary to always be drawing lots of highly detailed backgrounds, but I thought it'd be interesting for you to see how much my style evolved and how I became almost a little obsessed with showing people the location of a scene. Now here, before the scene gets going, we have this giant double-page spread that really is kind of crawling with detail. I was determined that the reader have a sense of where these guys are, and by putting it first, this kind of gets burned into the brain of the person reading the scene, and then I can move on to close-ups and maybe not show so much in terms of background, but just sort of count on the reader to be orientated in space, and they can sort of carry in their brains, okay, I know where they are as they're talking to each other. And you don't have this sort of floating in the middle of nowhere problem that you can sometimes have when there are lots and lots of blank panel backgrounds. Let's move on to the next piece of advice. To keep a location from seeming generic, include details that are quirky and specific. So again, let's begin with a kind of a negative example. Billy Click Creech Battler, this series that I did many years back. In fact, the pages are starting to turn yellow. 2005, I think, was when I did this one. And this opening establishing shot, Billy Click, our main character, skateboarding through a kind of vaguely suburban setting. Kind of generic, I would have to admit. It doesn't have a whole lot in terms of specific quirky details. Now, by contrast, and it's not really a fair comparison, I suppose, but in this Akiko story that I did years ago, there was a location where they were going to be buying and selling robots at one point in the story, and I created this highly specific and unusual, almost bizarre, one might say, location established in a big double-page spread, which indeed was what I'd done with Billy Click, but I took much more advantage of showing details, making it a specific place. And indeed, you can imagine, ever since Tatooine, the kind of desert planet has been a go-to location in sci-fi, so you can imagine a much more boring, nondescript kind of structure than this, for sure. I was determined to, get something that would be one of a kind, and that's something to keep in mind as you design locations for your own stories. A knowledge of 1, 2, and 3-point perspective is extremely helpful. Some would say it is essential. This time let's look at a scene from Miki Falls, my manga-style graphic novel series. Here is a location where I really wanted to make sure people felt that they were inside this room. It's in an old Japanese farmhouse. And it's kind of a 2-point, slightly leaning into a 3-point perspective illustration. There's no way I could have done a drawing like this without some understanding of perspective. So if you haven't learned at least those 3 different types, 1, 2, and 3-point perspective, check out the links that I will put in the info box of this video. I have made 6 different videos that give you a pretty thorough introduction to perspective. Interestingly, this one also serves as an example of the kind of quirky and specific, these daikon radishes, lots of details, keeps it from being a sort of generic, we're in Japan kind of illustration. It seems to be a specific, one-of-a-kind location. Don't forget the importance of lighting. It can be the single most crucial element in conveying mood and atmosphere. So it's back to Brody's Ghost. I know I've used this as an example in previous videos, but it really is maybe my best example of lighting, at least in recent years. This pawn shop that Brody and Talia, the ghost, go into, and specifically this frame right here, really the focus is on the lighting, how he's going from this brightly lit midday exterior into this very dimly lit sort of den of iniquity kind of interior. And in a way, what I did is I put so much time into conveying the lighting here that I was able to ease back on it a little bit in subsequent scenes. Different artists might, try to be more consistent, but you can see by the time I got here, I wasn't trying to focus on the lighting so much. I figured people had kind of gotten the point and that we could move on to other things. But certainly something to keep in mind. Imagine this illustration without any of the darker areas, and you wouldn't have anything like the type of mood that you have here now. Just because a location is fictional doesn't mean it can't be inspired by a place in the real world. If a sense of realism is your goal, consider using reference. So this is from Akiko again. Right on the front cover you can see this location that I created, the upside down city of Galorando, and it is this sort of bizarre fantasy location where all the buildings are built upside down. Years later I saw in Avatar: The Last Airbender a very similar location, and I do wonder if they hadn't been influenced, or who knows, maybe just a coincidence. But I wanted to point out how the structures here are very clearly based on kind of European models, the tile rooftops and so forth, that I wasn't just doing total fantasy type structures like I did in that other illustration, that it was inspired by real-life European locations. And so that's probably a pretty good example of how just because something's a fantasy land doesn't mean that it can't be inspired by places you've seen in the real world. Most creators seek contrast between different locations in the story, both for the sake of variety and to make sure readers immediately know where the scene is taking place. So this is from Brody's Ghost, Book 5. The entire series takes place in this sort of decaying, near-future, dystopian, urban setting. Lots of these kinds of interiors and exteriors where everything seems to be falling apart. And at one stage, I wanted him to leave the city, and we have this big double-page spread, again relying quite a bit on perspective. And off he goes to the countryside, and very deliberately I get rid of all of that, high rises and decaying stuff, and we create this kind of idealized rural setting, and pretty much everything you see, like this farmer guy, you get this very clear idea of having left one location and having arrived at a very different location many, many miles away. So that's something to keep in mind for your own stories. If you have more than one location, consider making them visually strikingly different. As I said, just for variety, or helping the reader to know that they have moved from one place to another. In a panel that has both a foreground and a background, I prefer to maintain visual clarity between the two. Now, in Mastering Manga 3, I created very specifically an example to show what I'm talking about here, comparing these two different panels. I'll zoom in here so you can have a better look. We have this foreground character standing against a background of buildings, and by placing the buildings right next to her head, it's not super clear. The darkness of her hair is helping her to pop forward, but it would be so much easier to see the foreground from the background if we separate those two elements. So this kind of very clear contour is what I'm always going for in my own work. Now notice I'm not saying you should always do this. Actually, none of these things are meant to be put in that spirit, but it's something to keep in mind. If you have a choice between laying it out this way and laying it out this way, I personally prefer the second approach. Returning to the same location but showing it in a different state can add a sense of realness to your story. So this is in Miki Falls. In the first book in the series, Brody and Miki go together to this shrine way up at the top of this mountain. Those of you who've watched my videos know that I was thinking of a specific temple in Fukuyama, Japan, where we sometimes go, and kind of allowing this to be inspired by that location with these long steps heading up into the mountains. But I wanted to show you how I returned. This was sort of in the springtime. I returned to this location in Miki Falls, winter, and we come back to the exact same place, except now there's snow on the ground. Well, having come back and seen this same location in a different state, I think just gives this sense of, oh wow, that location was there all along. It's a real place in the real world, and seeing it, you know, coming back to it again after a long separation of not having been there, and then seeing it in a slightly different state, I think does sort of add to, you know, making this seem like a real life place. If you're using a computer as part of your art creation process, you can cut and paste some backgrounds, saving yourself a lot of time and effort. Be cautious about overdoing it, though. So this is from the Akiko series, The University of Malbadoo, and this panel here I think is a pretty good establishing shot, but once we get inside, you can see that Crilley hit upon the idea of using a scanned image of books on shelves. Could serve as the background for panel after panel after panel. It's very sort of flat and repetitious, and personally I feel like I just sort of overdid it, and anyone even looking at it casually maybe just gets the sense like they're standing in front of a screen or something. It just doesn't seem real. Let me show you years later in Brody's Ghost when I was able to maybe refine this process a little better. So returning to this location that I'd showed you earlier, the very final panel in the scene is a pretty detailed version of the same location as they walk off into the distance. And to save myself time from having to draw all this stuff over and over again, I reused it over here, but I tried to do it in such a way that it wasn't glaringly obvious. In fact, here you can see the wind sort of blowing the laundry here. I actually went to the trouble of redrawing all of that, knowing that if anyone compared the two, they would say, hey, wait a minute, how come the laundry is frozen in space and time? Indeed, I admit I reused it even in other locations here, like back here. This is flipped around and dropped in here again. But I sort of misted it out. I made it much lower in contrast and just hoped that people wouldn't pay too close attention to it. Not a bad way of saving yourself some time if you're using, like I said, a computer program. Nothing wrong with cutting and pasting and reusing backgrounds if indeed you can be careful about it and not do it in such a way that it becomes really obvious. And finally, number 10, some comic creators begin a scene with several silent location panels, giving readers a sense of what it's like to be there. So for this one, I thought I would return to the Mastering Manga series, but just for fun, let's look at the French version, Dessiné des Manga. And here you can see where I created very specifically an example of what I'm talking about here, of putting in this case, two different panels that just sort of give you a little view of a distant shot and then a slightly random shot of clothes on the line. Just sort of give you a moment to take a breath and put yourself in that place before we move on to the dialogue or whatever it is that you want to achieve in that scene. It is not a technique that I've used as much as I would have liked over the years, but I can show you at least one example from the Akiko series. So this is from an Akiko story called Bornstone's Elixir. I had one scene with my characters Spuckler and Mr. Biba come to an end. I sort of visually left a little bit of gap between the two panels, and then we start in this new location, and I spent 3 panels really just setting up the feeling of what it's like to be in this place, having your sort of camera pointed at the sky to see the moon, a little backpack here, and then the crackling fire, even kind of a sound effect being used here to help set the scene, and then you get into the actual dialogue that's going to be at the heart of it. What this requires is setting aside some of the real estate of your story to devote to these panels. It's very artistic, but you may find, as I often have, that space is at a premium, and I just couldn't afford to devote that many panels to something that was just a kind of painterly setup. But, as I say, I kind of look back and regret it. I wish I could have used this technique more, and who knows, maybe in the future I will be able to do just that. And just to sort of wrap things up, I thought I would come back to The Beast That Ate Morioka, my very first story, where I pointed out that I didn't do much in terms of backgrounds as I began the story. But interestingly, as I reached the end of the story, I had learned the importance of backgrounds, and you can see me trying to create atmosphere with lighting and so forth. And this little scene here with the two characters talking, interesting even to me to see how much it foreshadows what I would end up doing with Brody's ghost, having them not just standing in the middle of nowhere talking to each other, but trying to put you into a specific location with the cherry blossom petals falling and so forth. It just goes to show you the way to learn is to actually sit down and make a story. You will find by the end of it that you have improved and you've learned some of the tricks of the trade, and hopefully this video and the rest of the videos in this series will serve to do the same, lend you some of my knowledge about creating comics, manga, whatever it is that you want to make. But let's go ahead and wind this video down. I want to thank you all for watching it. I hope you found it useful, and I'll be back with another one real soon.